All right, welcome to tonight's work session. Ooh, what's that? All right.
Spicy.
We're good now. I think we're styling. All right. On the capital improvement plan, yes, it is August 19th, and we are starting to talk about the capital improvement plan. We've had 2 months without budget discussions, but we're back at it. I'm going to pass it over to the city manager, who's going to go through the presentation.
Thank you, Your Honor. Bear with me just a moment. I'm trying to figure out how to share something. That is going to be, there we go. Try this, and I don't know how to share. And I might need Robert, the producer, to come back out. Where's Trevor when you need him?
He just got up. He's on his way.
That's not coming out.
I just see the door opening.
Oh, you got to click share. There you go. Presentation.
New producer and composer.
Yeah, it's just more staff now.
Yeah, good for CIP.
Kevin does that for them.
There to the rest.
Hey.
Thank you, Mayor.
Look at that.
It's good.
And then you can just play slideshow.
Close enough to the screen to read it.
All right, thanks, Robert. Thanks for bearing with me. So thank you all for being here tonight. You're probably wondering why are we talking about the CIP in August, and that is intentional. And we'll get to the timing and some of our recommendations, but what we've heard from counselors and members of the public is that they'd like input earlier on. They'd like to keep the CIP more top of mind, as the whole budget is really a 12-month process, and that way we always keep in mind priorities that inform the capital improvement plan as they roll into the incorporation of the budget. So for tonight's purposes, and thank you to the staff for being here, because we are all a united front on not only the work that goes into the CIP, but making improvements and enhancements and always trying to tweak and improve on what we do. So we'll give a couple slides on overview. We'll talk preliminary priorities. We'll remind folks of the financial limitations, and we'll discuss recommendations and considerations. So reminder of what the heck is a CIP and why do we have one. It is a capital improvement plan. It helps us to, and it really is a plan, and we will use that word plan over and over and over. It's a plan that does not commit money, but it suggests a way to fund for projects. It helps to identify capital needs with input from all the stakeholders. It helps us as staff and council to understand priorities and to plan for funding allocations across years and across projects and across priorities, really. And it allows us to keep within the appropriate, keep up with appropriate maintenance, accessibility in a planned manner for both things we own and maintain and things we plan for. So what qualifies as a capital improvement plan project these are a friendly reminder for folks, and sometimes you'll think, why do we continue to repeat some information? We like to allow this information to live on in presentations that people can access after the fact. So as a reminder, what qualifies is anything related to construction or expansion of a public facility, rehabilitation in excess of $50,000, design work or a planning study related to a capital project or an item that comes up as part of the master plan, an item with assets greater than $50,000 that is either non-vehicular or vehicles or rolling stock, as well as land. So as we head into priorities and considering priorities, it's good to think about how projects are evaluated and prioritized. And for us, we consider this in 3 different buckets, if you will. The first being core function. Does it respond to a requirement? Are we being asked or mandated by a regulator or a legal entity to do so? Does it address a public health or safety need? Does it help fix something that is broken? This would really speak to roads, sidewalks, bridges, water, sewer, stormwater, maintaining facilities, including schools, maintaining and providing upgrades to our information technology, and really anything having to do with city facilities or vehicles. Number 2, the second bucket speaks to a financial benefit. Will it allow for us to access matching funds, grant funds, public-private partnership money? Will it help with the timing or efficiency with an adjacent or a synergistic project? And will it, in the long term, help reduce long-term operating costs? We have several of those examples, but things that speak to facility upgrades that help keep us in the general maintenance mode. Again, projects receiving grant funding or projects that can work in tandem together. The third bucket is something that comes from community input, from a community plan, or a general improvement that people would like to see. This could be referred to as the nice to have versus the need to have. And these are items identified in a planning document or study, things that improve quality of life or add capacity, things that provide incentives to economic development for the city and the region, or things that respond to a citywide goal or a submitted request of residents or the council. Think land acquisition, think general improvements to recreation and parks and our library, and things of that nature. So next, here we go. So now as we transition into understanding and being reminded of our financial limitations, they're really guideposts set up by our longstanding fiscal policies. And as you all know, there are two ways to fund capital projects. The first is with cash or capital outlay. We call it pay-as-you-go. And the city's long-term goal for capital outlay funding is to use no more than 2% of the prior year budget in that cash-like fashion. And to remind you all of the fiscal year we're in, we are at 1.18%. We're proud of that number. And similarly, the other way to fund capital projects is through net debt service, and following the other city policy to stay within and below 10% of that general fund budget number. We, for this fiscal year, are at 8.16%. And something that you'll see on this slide that you'll also see on the next slide is what we call our 10-year outlook. And what this is not only the next, the current set of 6-year CIP years, but what we'd like to show going forward. And I think, Councilor Cook, I think you were one early on to say, can you look out in years 6 through 10? And I think this is a good slide to show that in years 6 through 10, we have ability to recognize not only new debt that comes on, but also debt that comes off the debt schedule. And as you will see, and as we've lived in the 5 budgets I've been around for, we always manage to bring down projections below that 10%. So back to reminding folks that this is a tool that helps us navigate financial planning, gives us advance notice so that when we need to adjust schedules or consider reprioritizing, to always stay with and within and below 10%, we are able to do that. So this chart shows project information as of the fiscal year that just ended June 30th. This does not include any new or updated projects. This just shows what we've committed to in the current 6-year CIP. And Andrew Pergo would tell you that it's important to keep in mind the mix of bond timelines utilized, because we can spread things out depending on the asset over a different lifespan. Some are 5 years, some are as many as 30 years, depending on the project's useful life. And another thing to point out that's important here is that this includes the total amount of debt assumed for a community policing facility of 42.2, and I will keep going from there. I'd like to just spend a minute on this slide because this really hit us like a ton of bricks in a really positive way. In the last 5 years, we have completed and or started 457 projects, which total over $308 million. That's not insignificant. And so when people say, what good is a plan for, it really helps us to not only look at what we need to do, but look back at what we have done. So the pie chart on the left, and this was a little tough for us to figure out the best way to convey this information to you. The pie chart on the left is by fund. So essentially, blue and yellow is water and sewer. So 60% of the projects are utility. The other 40 are other governmental, those are special revenue fund, general fund, all those types of funds. Another thing to point out is anything blue or yellow is not a burden borne by the taxpayer. Those are water and sewer ratepayers. So separate constituencies, so to speak. The pie chart on the right speaks to the ways we can fund a project. So we can identify a project and decide which fund it may tap, but then we can get creative or understand from a timing perspective how to utilize which type of funding to best support the project and in a time certain. So of the pie chart on the right, of the $308 million, 68% will use bond or state revolving loan fund monies, and that 68% is over $200 million. Capital outlay or rolling stock or supplemental appropriations represents 11%, or just over $34 million. And the real exciting piece of this pie is the bottom right in the form of grants or trusts or donations. This represents 21% of funding that we have tapped and identified and become eligible for that does not become a taxpayer burden. And that is over $65 million of that 308 total. So we're proud of that piece. So, global thoughts on the CIP, reminder to all, it's a plan. It doesn't commit any money. It allows for future fiscal resource allocation to better inform council and staff as we all work to make the right decisions on how to spend and handle competing limited resources for competing projects. It is used in the development of the city's annual budget. It will contain both existing projects as well as new ones, and I think the impact tonight is to think about when you add new projects, it will have impact on the existing projects. And how do we reconcile that? The movement of an addition or of one project or another may affect the timeline, and that's a different way of saying what I just said in the bullet before. And that, please note that management is prepared to make recommendations on projects that could be pushed out to an out year, removed altogether. We have a running list of that. It's one of the lists we keep as we start to bump up against the 10%, and how is it that we would recommend we come back down. So, second to last slide really gets to why we're here tonight. We would like to propose some changes to the CIP that in our opinion would enhance public input by the council, and input by the planning board, working more closely together to give staff and folks and stakeholders alike input that we need to clarify priorities at the start of this process, so we're not playing catch-up midstream. It would give everyone involved a better understanding of the CIP within our larger global budget picture, and we think it's helpful to understand city council priorities at the outset so that staff can communicate that to planning board and members of the public, and that can all be fed into the citizen response process as well. So we all think that earlier engagement will yield a better, more well-rounded and informed plan. So the last thing to propose to you all is a different time frame. We are in the August blurb right now, and anything with a little human next to it means that it's an opportunity for public input. And so tonight we're talking about a work session. We're having that now. In September, we would have slightly moved up deadlines for both citizen requests as well as department submissions. And then in October, we would have, as we have had in the last 2 years, a citizen request meeting to understand requests that they may have that are separate and apart from what we already include in our CIP. In November, this is where a lot of the things that happen in late winter, early spring are being suggested to shift to. So on November 12th, which is a Tuesday, we would propose, and I think that's an off meeting night, that's a night all by itself, to have a joint work session with the council and the full planning board sitting like this, giving an overview of what we see. At the November 18th council meeting, we would propose the joint public hearing between the council and the planning board. Typically, planning has their own in November and adopts recommendations in December. This allows one big presentation. We're all hearing the same thing at the same time. Planning board would vote as they do to make recommendations to the CIP, but a month earlier at the November planning board. And then the city council would adopt the plan with no funding attached in December, and that would help inform and be incorporated into the budget, which we roll out in full force in January. And that way the guidance from council isn't coming backward. Typically, we've gotten guidance at the end of January, early February, and that's about the time we're rolling with the CIP again. So I've asked the question of myself and thinking out loud to anticipate a question you may have, which is, what do you do in an election year? If a council's being asked to adopt a CIP in December, what we would suggest is it's still a plan. The plan can be amended. The plan can be revisited by a new council that comes in, may have different priorities, but at least it keeps the process consistent and in a more informed manner as it hits the rest of the budget. So that is me done talking, and we're all here to see what you think of that. We're all here to take feedback and learn from you.
Well, I'd start by just introducing the chair of the planning board, since you don't have to do roll call, but Chairman Shellman, thank you for being here tonight. Notice a few members of the planning board in audience as well. Thank you for the process. Are there questions? Councilor Bagley.
Thanks, Aaron. Just quickly on the part with the pie graphs, and I think you mentioned 65 million is 21%. I just want to clarify, the graph represents the dollar amount, not the number of projects.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Assistant Mayor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just to come, I'm really happy we're doing this. I think over the last couple budget cycles, I've had a frustration that it feels pretty backloaded. So I'm really excited to get this started earlier. Getting to planning board, I'm excited about a joint public hearing. I think that's fundamental and really important to make sure these two bodies that represent so many stakeholders in our community are having a public hearing together to work out any differences or plans that really affect the two.
Councilor Moreau.
Just had a thought and an idea about whether or not we might actually want to, we have that meeting with just talking about the citizens' request with a few planning board members. Should we also invite then the chair of the planning board so he can also hear firsthand, be able to put it out to that board as well as far as the concerns regarding citizen requests?
I think that'd be great, and what we could do is invite the planning board and notice it as a possible quorum that night. That way it's more inclusive, everyone's hearing everything together.
Councilor Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have just a few questions about some structural things on the CIP budget. One of them is specifically around the school's budget and capital improvements at schools. I know that there's quite a bit of tension between enacting certain policies, like, for example, considering a solar array over a parking lot at the high school, because it increases the budget on the school's side, not in the general budget side or the CIP general side. And that means that counts against them for other school improvements. Is there a reason why we always lump building improvements in schools into the school's budget? Or is there a way to separate out certain improvements in the school's budget if they're priorities of the council?
You've stumped the staff. Hold on.
It's a great question, Councilor. I guess ongoing operational maintenance is included in the school budget. The only example that I can think of where something that felt capital was discussed at length as an operating item was the most recent conversation about the modulars. I think because of timing and because of the initial perception or the initial estimates for cost, it certainly could have been a capital item, but its timeliness, it ended up being a $92,000 plug number, I think, that we had as we were going into that process and that conversation. But initially it was thought to be about half of that because we had estimated leasing costs as opposed to implementation, setup, and everything else that would go along. So I would say that in that case, that could have been a capital item had it been considered in a more timely manner. But I would suggest to you that normally anything that fits the description that we've just talked about it does end up as a part of the capital plan, as a part of the CIP process. The schools have had the benefit of rolling what we call a capital improvement or facilities improvement element sheet. You see that every year, and it's somewhat of a catch-all. And that is used to try to address some things like boilers and roofs that aren't necessarily as easily predicted as we would hope, so that we can address things that come up in the midst of addressing things that are very much scheduled. And so I guess, I'm not sure if that totally answers it, but I think normally that's the case. Things like painting and carpeting, those end up looking like and acting like operating expenses for us. Sometimes those dollars look bigger than they would in other smaller buildings because of the size of the schools. But Mr. Lynchy has carried that in his budget generally.
I have a quick follow-up on that point, but you
I do
might
too. I have
all
a
right.
follow-up on that point too. I think I'm asking specifically about things like putting a solar array over the high school parking lot or air conditioning at Little Harbor School and Don Darrow School. And these are big ticket items that I want to make sure we are carrying on in the general budget side in the CIP, that the schools don't feel like that's somehow counting against them for school buildings improvements.
So I guess I won't answer a question as much as comment. Superintendent and I, over the last year or so, participate in conversations, and I heard him repeatedly say, assuming that the slice of the pie, if you will, that the schools have access to is consistent, there are only so many priorities that can be served. If the pie was going to grow, something like air conditioning at one of the elementary schools or two of the elementary schools might rate higher. It's an interesting conversation about how far-reaching should the list of priorities be that the schools bring? And I think there has always been temperance or prudence in trying hard not to reach too far, considering the aforementioned core functions, synergies, et cetera. So I won't speak for the superintendent further, but I don't know how you would issue license to the school department to say, please ask for more, or please list things for our consideration that go beyond.
Just a quick follow-up on that, and then just as a note, the charter is pretty clear because even if the auxiliary classrooms, they were not a capital expenditure because they were not in perpetuity. But if they had been, even if they were above $50,000, still no purview from the city council. Maybe, but Councilor Cook raises an interesting question in your response. If the city had a consolidated view of building management and maintenance, and that fell under the city, this might alleviate some of those operating concerns and potentially find savings from we can do more with the same staff, not reducing the staff, but do more in other parts of the city as well.
Zach is poised to say something, if you don't mind.
I'll be really quick. Zach McLaughlin, Superintendent. I think the answer is that there's not a formal. It's not formal, but my assumption has been, based on the 10%, based on the existing policies, financial policies, that we would be in a situation where like Nathan said, that our portion of the pie would be, within a range of about what we would have when we think about our planning. Of course, I think it's always within the purview of the council to decide to make other decisions. But as we do our long-term financial planning, the assumption is we're going to be kind of inside of a certain area, give or take. What's, for us, longer term out, I mean, the bigger ticket item for us comes in FY30 at this point, where there's the money that would come from the state that we need to match connected with our CTE work. But yes, when we went through the citizens process last year, there were citizens who came forth with proposals around air conditioning across the schools. And our answer at the time was, we'd love to have that, but not if we have to sacrifice the other projects we have in the pipeline that we think are, at the moment, more core function and less a want. So, hope that helps.
Thanks, Councilor Cook. Follow-up on that? Or separate question?
I just was going to note that maybe this is something that we should talk about and consider further in this process about how we are allocating those funds. And
Yeah, I think under like a building maintenance standpoint, I mean, we own the buildings, the schools use the buildings, and we can't kick them out of those buildings, like, right of first refusal, but I would like to have that conversation as it regards all the maintenance of those buildings. Councilor Blaylock.
Thank you. Yeah, I just kind of had a clarifying question. You mentioned the solar array, like if it went over the parking lot at the high school or something. Meaning more like projects that would help the city and help the school, you know what I mean? Kind of serve both. Because I remember having this thought when we were returfing the high school football field. Obviously, it benefits the school a lot, but it also benefits the community because they use it all summer. Or so you use the track, for example, But that's, I thought that was the same thought you were thinking.
If I may, Mr. Mayor? If I understand what you're saying is that look for synergies potentially from an operational standpoint. However, when I hear you speak towards large capital projects such as solar arrays and things like that, they still come out of the same pie. So no matter what, the synergies, we may have some improvements of operation. We'd have to explore those types of things. But those are operational expenses. Those aren't capital expenses. And that may, I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on that. Okay.
Yeah, we don't get to make any money by making those changes, but when Nathan was talking about how typically it's separate because the operation and upkeep of those has been separate, if they weren't separate and we looked at the buildings as the buildings and the operational maintenance and so forth was under on one kind of department, that might it might help us prioritize this as well.
I understand. Thank you for the clarification.
Any other council questions? Councilor Bagley and then Councilor Cook.
Just kind of looking at the long-range plans, we had several decades of extremely low interest rates, which have kind of come to an end. Has that greatly upset the future planning, or have we accounted for 6-7% or whatever our typical interest rates are going to be going
Well,
forward?
actually, our last bond was just, the 20s were just under 4, so they came in pretty good. And, yeah, that's one of the variables that are in this model is the interest rate. So we take everything into account, and we're conservative. We knew interest rates were going to be higher, but they actually came in about the same as the year before, so we did pretty good.
Excellent.
Great job.
Triple A
Wish I
bond
could
rate.
get under 4.
Councilor Cook.
This is one more just structural for the CIP itself, the way we prepare it. I think I would be interested in making sure we have kind of a checkbox in the CIP. We have 2 different policies that are going to trigger expenses for the city. One of them is if something triggers the public art percent for art program. It'd be great if there was just a checkbox so it was clear that everybody on the council knew and the city
Kind of
staff
call it
knew.
out. Yep.
Yeah, so that this, and the same thing with it, if it triggers our new green buildings policy as well, because that also impacts cost. Hopefully it doesn't. A lot of those improvements are actually reduced cost, but it'd be nice to know, so we're planning.
So I have, I guess, I'm hoping that this would work out well. I do have, I felt that in at least last 2 years and this year, having the CIP kind of fall later in the process has been difficult, or lost opportunity to start earlier. But we've also had councils kind of carry over, and especially in the second year, it makes a lot of sense to bring it forward. But that's also an election year. I would love to see some policy around the continuity of this, and thus the planning board, who extends past those, is going to be a big part of that, as they are a big part of the creation of this, to make sure it aligns to the master plan. So would love to hear from Chairman Shellman on any thoughts from this proposal, and any floor is open. Rick, if you have anything.
I like the idea of, getting more people involved and getting the public involved sooner. I've got a technical question. Maybe it's a question for the city attorney. If we need to establish a broader capital improvements committee, which is, I think, one of the things authorized under the statute, because the planning board, of course, votes to adopt it, and then you recommend it to the council, and you guys actually work with it. But there is a procedure where you can have a broader committee that's just for capital improvements. I don't know if we need that, but that could be one option. Your continuity question, though, I'm not fully understanding that one.
So say in November, all these bums get voted out, new bums get put in. What happens, like the whole process has to start again, because you'll be adopting, the new council at that point will adopt the CIP, of which has already been in December adoption, because it will be formally voted on as part of the budget, because we have to go through and all that, so it can be undone, as I would understand it, by the next council. And so from a continuity standpoint, if the planning board is the one that will, for the most part, there's a chance for appointments to overlap in that time, but for the most part will remain consistent across those 2 different councils. If they are vastly different, that's where I think it's important, if we're to front load this and take advantage of having this kind of, which I think is a good idea, color the budget process and not be necessarily kind of front loaded in January and February, but to color the budget process, which I think is important to do. It's also important to make sure that there's continuity between the planning board and the new city council if it's vastly different than the previous city council.
Okay, well, of course, staff's feeding a lot of information into this process, and this is helping staff, I think, greatly with the planning that they need to do. And then the planning board, by listening to all that and with the counselors participating at the same time, which I think is a great idea, everybody's better informed. If, as you say, all the bums get voted out, the plan is still a plan, and it can be changed at any time anyway. The same bums can vote to change it. So things happen. And February, April, March, something new may happen that informs a different decision, whether a small one or a large one. One thing that ties into this is the master plan, though, and we really, I've got a meeting with the city manager later this week to talk about that. That's why the planning board, that's why I have a seat at this table. It's because it's directly tied into that. And it is a capital improvement plan. We are the planning board. We're supposed to plan for the future and help the council with the planning aspects of this. So I think that's where your continuity comes in. It links with the master plan, because the master plan isn't going to be updated every year, certainly. And it's been a few years. A lot has happened in the city since the last time it was updated. We are planning to get it started relatively soon, hopefully soon. And that will provide some gravitas and also some continuity, I think, with the process, because you're supposed to be in conformance with the master plan as well. So I think that might help with some of what you're saying.
You raise a good point there. What I'm thinking about is probably more a specific project in the plan itself that might have a different constituency in terms of a post-election, but the majority of the plan, and that can change without an election. Things can change and priorities can shift. So the vast majority of the CIP, with the help of the planning board, with staff, aligns to the master plan, which should not have as much variance as maybe one in particular project there. Okay, so help me allay the concern.
And also the process you're starting tonight with more public involvement, I would think would create more of a buy-in to the ultimate product as well. Otherwise, if you get a new set of new counselors or something else that's just a little bit different, it would seem unlikely there would be a vast constituency saying you shouldn't do that thing that you talked about last fall because that's a terrible idea. But we had 200 people that supported it and came to the meetings, and so I'll be quiet.
No, that was helpful, Councilor Bagley.
Thank you, Aaron. And kind of to your point, I think moving this up makes sense for two reasons. One, I do recall that we changed some things, like we took them out of the CIP and used ARPA funds, or we took them out of the CIP because we just couldn't get to them, or whatever reason. So changes happen regardless, right up until the adoption of the budget, it seems like. So that doesn't change. But by doing this sooner, all the low-profile projects, the nuts and bolts projects, it would be better to have an experienced council kind of put those things into place rather than, because I know when at least speaking for myself, when I was first elected, and on day one, it's like, here's the CIP, you got to figure out where the sidewalks are going to go and what sewer pipes to fix. That's a lot to ask of somebody that has to come up to speed. Whereas if you've been doing it for a couple of years, you can figure out all the low-profile projects that aren't controversial, and you understand the timelines of them better. And then if there are controversial projects, those are going to change after election, regardless if we were to do the nuts and bolts parts before or after. So I support this process. I think it's a better, more streamlined way to do it that will actually get more public input because it's happening sooner. And then I think if there are controversial things that cause some of us to get voted out, there's still ample opportunity for a new council to make those changes if they so desire.
Councilor Cook.
I was going to point out as well, if you look at the timeline, generally the public hearings would take place after elections in November.
Yeah, but people are tired
So
of that.
whoever is elected to a new council in a new council year would be able to attend those.
Right.
as
Yep.
well.
Good point.
All right. Are there other questions or comments? It's time for public comment. Anybody rising to speak to, for, or against? Or nothing, we're just to, this plan, CIP in general, having more or less. All right. Not seeing any. Are there any final questions for the council? Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. We'll be back here at 7 p.m. Thank you, Chairman Shellman, for being here, City Manager. All right.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for doing it.